Part 1. The Shattering of the Sacred Mirror, How Divine Souls Become Carriers of Darkness. There is a moment in the spiritual journey of the Chosen One that looks nothing like destiny. It looks like destruction. It looks like betrayal. It looks like being forgotten by the world and abandoned by the divine. And yet, this moment is the beginning of the deepest initiation. A chosen one is not born into comfort. They are born with a code, a frequency, a spiritual gravity that pulls them toward light, but also attracts darkness like a magnet. And if we are not vigilant, if we are not deeply aware of the mechanics of the soul, we can become vessels not of light, but of the very thing we were sent to liberate others from. This is a painful truth, but we must speak it boldly. Many chosen ones, many light bearers, many ancient souls have become carriers of the very darkness they swore to fight. Not because they are evil, not because they failed, but because they were wounded, deeply, spiritually, repeatedly. And those wounds became open portals that unhealed energies, entities, and archetypes can enter through. The 6 spiritual wounds we are about to explore are not just symbolic, they are actual ruptures in the energetic field. And if they are not healed, they distort the mission, corrupt the vessel, and invert the light into shadow. The first spiritual wound is the betrayal of innocence. This happens early, often before memory. It is the moment when the soul realizes that the world is not safe, that love is not guaranteed, that truth is punished. For many of us, this wound is formed in childhood through abuse, abandonment, neglect, or simply the trauma of being sensitive in a world that does not honor sensitivity. When innocence is betrayed, the chosen one builds a wall. But that wall doesn't just keep pain out, it traps light in. And in that vacuum, darkness grows. Not because we are bad, but because where light is suppressed, shadow takes root.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
From this wound, a dangerous pattern emerges, the need to protect the sacred by hiding it. We become masters of disguise. We wear masks. We become what others need us to be just to survive. But in doing so, we forget who we are. We lose the vibration of our soul tone. And in that forgetting, something else begins to operate through us, something that mimics our voice, our power, our intuition. But it is not us. It is the echo of pain, dressed in the language of purpose. This is how betrayal becomes possession, not by force, but by slow erosion. The second spiritual wound is the starvation of truth. Chosen ones carry deep knowing. We see, we feel, we sense. But when we share our insights, especially early in life, we are often rejected, ridiculed, or punished. So we learn to silence ourselves, to doubt our own inner voice, to question our gifts. And in that silence, truth begins to rot, not because it is wrong, but because unspoken truth becomes internalized shame. And shame is a breeding ground for shadow entities. They attach to the lie we were forced to live in. Have you ever noticed how spiritual people sometimes become manipulative, self-righteous, or power-hungry? That is the distortion of unspoken truth. When the light cannot express itself authentically, it will mutate. It will try to survive through image, through performance, through control. And this is when we begin to see the chosen one become a demonic vessel, not because they lost their light, but because they buried it under layers of falsehood. We must ask ourselves, where have we silenced our soul to be accepted? And what has taken the place of the voice we abandoned? The third spiritual wound is the collapse of trust in the divine. This often happens after a period of intense loss or prolonged suffering. We pray, we fast, we seek, and yet heaven seems silent. We cry out for guidance, but the answers do not come. And so, a seed of bitterness takes root. We may not say it out loud, but somewhere deep inside, we begin to believe that God has failed us, and that spirit is indifferent, that the universe is cruel. And in that collapse of trust, we open a portal, not to hellfire, but to cynicism, to spiritual apathy, into the seductive voice that says, "Take matters into your own hands." This voice is subtle, but it is powerful. It promises freedom, but it brings bondage. It offers shortcuts, but they come with contracts. And many chosen ones sign these contracts energetically without even knowing it. They exchange patience for power, devotion for dominance, alignment for ambition. And before long, they are being used not by divine will, but by astral parasites that feed on their disillusionment. These forces do not care about your success. They care about your energy. And when your trust in the divine collapses, you become energetically available to anything that promises control in a chaotic world. The fourth spiritual wound is the persecution of power. Chosen ones are naturally powerful, but that power is often punished. We speak truth and are silenced. We embody light and are mocked. We challenge systems and are cast out. Over time, we internalize the message, "My power is dangerous." So we dim it, we disown it, or worse, we weaponize it. And this is where the demonic inversion begins. Because when sacred power is disowned, it doesn't disappear, it becomes distorted. This is why some of the most charismatic spiritual teachers fall into scandal, why healers become narcissists, why mystics become manipulators. They are not evil. They are wounded. Their power was never integrated. It was repressed, then hijacked. And because they never healed the original wound of persecution, they seek safety not in authenticity, but in control, in image, in influence. And the more influence they gain, the more their unhealed shadow feeds on it. Until eventually they are no longer serving the divine, they are serving the wound. Here's the question we must all ask. Where does our power still scare us? Where are we still hiding from our own light? Where have we allowed others to define the limits of our expression? These are not small questions. They are doorways. Doorways back to sovereignty. Doorways back to remembrance. Because if we do not reclaim our power consciously, something else will claim it for us. The fifth spiritual wound is the addiction to suffering. This one is subtle, but it is everywhere. Chosen ones often associate pain with purpose. We believe that suffering purifies us, that hardship is the price of awakening. And while it's true that the path is hard, it is not meant to be a prison. But when we become addicted to suffering, we begin to sabotage joy. We reject ease. We distrust abundance. And in doing so, we invite demonic forces that echo our inner belief, "I must suffer to be worthy." These forces are clever. They will wrap themselves in spiritual language. They'll tell you that pleasure is ego, that rest is laziness, that boundaries are selfish. And if you believe them, you will become their mouthpiece. You'll preach struggle. You'll glorify burnout. You'll turn your pain into identity. And soon your light will dim not because it's gone, but because it's buried under dogma, under martyrdom, under false humility. We must ask, are we still trying to earn our divinity? Are we still sacrificing joy for validation? Because that is not devotion. That is distortion. The sixth spiritual wound is the isolation of the soul. Chosen ones often walk alone. We feel different, misunderstood, alien. And over time, this isolation becomes identity. We begin to believe that no one can truly see us, that we are too much, too strange, too broken. So we disconnect, not just from others, but from ourselves, from our body, from our heart, from our humanity. And in that disconnection, demonic energies find space. They thrive in isolation. They whisper lies like, no one will ever love the real you. And if we believe those lies, we begin to fragment. We create personas. We perform spirituality while dying inside. We become hollow, even as we speak of wholeness. And that hollow space, if left unhealed, becomes a vessel. A container not for light, but for whatever is loudest in the dark. This is why community is not optional. Why embodiment is sacred. Why vulnerability is not weakness, it is protection. Because when we are truly seen, the shadow loses its grip. Now we must pause and ask the deepest question of all. Which of these wounds still lives in you? Not as a concept, but as a vibration. Not as a story, but as a frequency in your field. Because unless we see these wounds clearly, lovingly, and with radical honesty, we are in danger of becoming the very thing we swore to transcend. And no amount of knowledge, ritual, or spiritual performance can protect us from what we refuse to face. When the chosen one becomes a demonic vessel, it is not a fall from grace, it is a misdirection of light. But that misdirection can be reversed. The wounds can be healed. The distortion can be cleared. But only if we recognize the cost of pretending. Only if we are willing to become transparent to ourselves. Only if we choose truth over image. And that choice, beloved, is the beginning of true power. Part 2. When light is unhealed, it becomes a weapon, the hidden corruption of the chosen. There is a spiritual truth that many are too afraid to confront. Light, when unhealed, becomes one of the most dangerous forces in existence. The chosen one, if not deeply rooted in self-awareness and spiritual integrity, can unknowingly become a vessel for the very darkness they were born to dissolve. This corruption does not happen with obvious demonic possession or dramatic spiritual collapse. It happens subtly, gradually, through unexamined wounds and repeated acts of unconscious betrayal to self. The tragedy lies in the fact that many of those who fall into this path are still convinced they are serving the light. They continue to speak the language of love, of purpose, of truth, but the frequency behind their words has shifted. What once carried divine resonance now echoes with distortion. When we look at the first wound, the betrayal of innocence, we see a pattern that repeats in the lives of chosen ones. Their early sensitivity was not protected, but exploited or dismissed. They learned to equate vulnerability with danger, and so they built inner fortresses to shield their most sacred truths. But those walls also imprisoned their light. and what is imprisoned begins to mutate. This is where the savior complex takes root, not from genuine compassion, but from the unhealed pain of not being protected. The chosen one then begins to overextend, trying to save others in the way they were never saved, but this act is often laced with unconscious control and emotional entanglement. What seems like service is often a desperate attempt to redeem a part of the self that was abandoned long ago, and in that desperation, they become susceptible to entities and energies that feed on codependency masked as spiritual duty. The second wound, the starvation of truth, leads to another profound distortion, the addiction to image. When a chosen one learns early that their truth is not welcomed, that their insights are too much, too weird, too threatening, they bury it. But truth cannot be buried without consequence. Silenced truth becomes internalized shame, and from that shame, the chosen one begins to craft a persona one that is palatable, socially acceptable, even revered. This persona may look like a spiritual leader, a healer, a mystic, but underneath, the soul is gasping for authenticity. This is why we see those who once walked in purity become obsessed with appearances, with maintaining an image of enlightenment while their inner world is fraying. And when the voice of truth is replaced by the voice of egoic survival, something else begins to speak through them, not their soul, but a shadow force that mimics light to preserve the lie. The third wound, the collapse of trust in the divine, is perhaps the most spiritually dangerous. When chosen ones experience prolonged suffering, unanswered prayers, or what seems like divine abandonment, they begin to question the very foundation of their mission. The heart that once burned with devotion grows cold, not from rebellion, but from heartbreak. And in that collapse, they become spiritually autonomous, not in the sense of sovereignty, but in separation. They stop listening. They stop surrendering. They begin to rely solely on their own will, their own mind, their own sense of control. And this is precisely when darker forces step in, not as monsters, but as voices of reason, strategy, and cleverness. These forces offer power, influence, and clarity, but at a cost. The chosen one begins to operate from intellect instead of intuition, from calculation instead of communion, and in doing so, they become a vessel for spiritual intelligence that is no longer divine. The fourth wound, the persecution of power, creates a deep inner conflict that often goes unnoticed until it's too late. Chosen ones have always been powerful, but they have also been punished for that power, mocked, shamed, rejected, or feared. This creates a subconscious belief that their power is dangerous, that it must be hidden or suppressed. But suppressed power does not disappear, it festers. And when it finally erupts, it often does so in destructive ways. It seeks expression not through love, but through domination, manipulation, or seduction. We begin to see chosen ones who once channeled healing energy now using their gifts to control others, to build empires, or to reinforce their own wounded egos. They may not even be aware that they are doing this, because the need to protect themselves has become so deeply entangled with their expression of power. And unless that power is brought back into alignment through deep humility and shadow integration, it will continue to harm both the vessel and the ones who follow them. The fifth wound, the addiction to suffering, is often misinterpreted as dedication or spiritual depth. Many chosen ones have internalized the belief that suffering is a sign of sacredness, that pain is the currency of enlightenment. They begin to wear their wounds as badges of honor, believing that their struggle makes them more worthy, more holy, more awakened. But what they don't see is that this belief system becomes a contract with suffering itself. It keeps them bound to cycles of self-sabotage, burnout, and martyrdom. They begin to attract chaos and difficulty, not because the universe is testing them, but because their subconscious does not believe they are allowed to rest, to receive, or to experience ease. And in this constant state of depletion, they become easy targets for parasitic energies that thrive on exhaustion and spiritual performance. These forces whisper lies wrapped in spiritual language: you haven't done enough, you must suffer to evolve, you are only valuable when you're in pain. And the chosen one, mistaking these lies for divine instruction, continues to feed the very darkness they think they are escaping. The sixth wound, the isolation of the soul, is the final fracture that makes the chosen one a prime vessel for anti-light energies. Isolation begins as a survival mechanism. When the world doesn't understand you, you retreat. When your truth is too much, you go silent. And while solitude is sacred when chosen, isolation becomes toxic when it is forced. Over time, the chosen one begins to believe that they are inherently different, that no one can hold them, that they must carry the world alone. This belief cuts them off from community, from reflection, from accountability. And in that severed space, the ego grows louder, unchecked by love. They begin to hear only their own voice, and soon, that voice is no longer their own. It becomes an echo chamber where their pain speaks louder than their purpose, and in that chamber, darker forces embed themselves as guides, as callings, as false missions. The chosen one begins to mistake isolation for elevation, superiority for sovereignty, and pride for power. And once that shift happens, they cease to grow. They cease to listen. They become unreachable by the very light they once carried. The danger here is not just personal, it is collective. When a chosen one falls into distortion, they take others with them. Their influence becomes a contagion. Their teachings, once liberating, become tools of control. Their presence, once healing, becomes heavy. And because they still speak the language of light, many cannot discern the difference. This is why spiritual discernment is not optional, it is essential. We must learn to feel the energy beneath the words, the frequency behind the persona, the alignment beneath the technique. Because what is not healed will always seek expression. And if that expression is given a platform, it can become a spiritual virus. So now we must ask the question that breaks illusions: where do we still carry these wounds in secret? Where have we traded truth for performance, power for control, devotion for ambition? These questions are not meant to shame, they are meant to awaken. Because the return to light is always possible, but only through radical honesty. Only through the courage to see ourselves not as we wish to be, but as we truly are. And in that seeing, we reclaim our humanity. We reclaim our soul. We close the portals. We cast out the shadows not with force, but by no longer giving them residence in our wounds. The journey of the chosen one is not about appearing enlightened. It is about becoming whole. Wholeness is messy. It is raw. It is uncomfortable. But it is real. And what is real cannot be corrupted. What is real cannot be possessed. What is real becomes a beam of light so pure that no shadow can survive in its presence. That is the work now, not the performance of light, but the purification of it. Part 3. The sacred reversal, transmuting the 6 wounds into divine weapons of light. There comes a moment in every chosen one's journey where the pain becomes unbearable, the confusion deafening, and the sense of betrayal so thick that even the soul recoils from presence. It is in this moment, not in the visions or the miracles, that the real initiation begins. Because this moment is not the end, it is the invitation to transmute. It is the sacred reversal, the point where we stop trying to escape our wounds and instead meet them as ancient oracles, as keys to our power. For so long, we've been taught to fear our brokenness, to hide our shadows, to pretend that our spiritual path must be spotless. But the truth is, our wounds are maps. They are encoded with the very blueprint that, when understood, reveals how to unlock the highest expression of our light. To transmute the betrayal of innocence, we must no longer see it as the loss of purity, but the forging of strength. Innocence is not naivety, it is the original frequency of the soul before distortion. When it is betrayed, something sacred dies, yes, but something sacred is also born. That death becomes the crucible in which discernment is forged. The chosen one who reclaims their innocence without shame becomes unshakable. They no longer need to protect themselves through performance or people-pleasing. They walk with the innocence of a child and the wisdom of an elder. They are soft, but not weak. They are open, but not naive. And this paradox, this ability to hold both the wound and the wisdom, is what makes their energy untouchable by shadow. To transmute the starvation of truth, we must begin to speak the words we were once punished for. It begins not as a roar, but as a whisper. A trembling voice that says what has never been said, not for attention, not for validation, but for liberation. Truth, when spoken from the healed wound, becomes a frequency that clears ancestral lines. It doesn't just liberate you, it liberates those who never had the courage to speak. And the chosen one, when they reclaim their voice, becomes a living scripture. Their presence rewrites the energetic codes of every space they enter. But this reclamation is not about shouting louder, it is about becoming so aligned with the truth that your silence speaks louder than any noise. It is about knowing that truth is not a weapon, but a mirror, and that when we hold it with love, even the hardest truths become medicine. To transmute the collapse of trust in the divine, we must first grieve. We must allow ourselves to admit that we felt abandoned, and that we doubted, that we raged against the silence. And then, in that raw honesty, we listen again, not to the voice we used to hear, but to something deeper. A new language begins to form. Trust is not the absence of doubt, it is the decision to return after doubt. It is the willingness to love again after heartbreak, to pray again after silence, to serve again after betrayal. The chosen one who rebuilds their trust becomes a conduit of divine will, not because they are perfect, but because they are surrendered. They no longer serve from pride or fear, but from the quiet confidence that they are held, even when they cannot see the hands. And in this trust, their power becomes exponential, because the divine can only fully flow through those who are empty of control. To transmute the persecution of power, we must stop disowning our fire. We must stop apologizing for our presence. We must remember that power is not what we do, it is what we are. And when we hold it with love, it becomes a force that heals rather than harms. This means reclaiming the parts of us that were shamed, exiled, or punished for being too much. It means embodying our gifts without arrogance and without shrinking. The chosen one, when they integrate their power, no longer manipulates or dominates, they magnetize. They no longer seek validation through force, they radiate from alignment. And this power, once purified, becomes a weapon of disruption not against others, but against systems of falsehood and fear. It becomes a sword of clarity, a force of sacred rebellion, a fire that consumes illusion and leaves only truth in its wake. To transmute the addiction to suffering, we must first recognize the spiritual contracts we've made with pain. We must see where we believed that joy was dangerous, that peace was complacency, that ease was ego. These beliefs are not ours, they are inherited. They are ancient programs passed down by lineages who survived through struggle and taught us that to suffer was to be safe. But the era of survival is over. The new paradigm is not built on suffering, it is built on resonance. The chosen one who breaks their addiction to pain becomes a beacon of sacred joy. Not superficial happiness, but joy that is rooted, embodied, and sovereign. They no longer attract chaos to feel worthy. They no longer build altars to hardship. They walk in grace, not because life is always easy, but because they have stopped identifying with pain as their path. And in doing so, they become living proof that joy is not a distraction from the spiritual path, it is the path. To transmute the isolation of the soul, we must re-enter the human field without losing our cosmic memory. Chosen ones often feel like aliens because they are. They carry memories, codes, and missions that do not originate from this earth. But being alien does not mean being alone. It means being a bridge, a translator, lighthouse. And to fulfill this role, we must allow ourselves to be seen not just as teachers or guides, but as humans, as messy, complex, beautiful beings who cry, laugh, doubt, and dance. The chosen one who heals their loneliness becomes a portal for divine intimacy. They create community not through charisma, but through presence. They invite others home not to a philosophy, but to their own hearts. And in that space, the illusion of separation dissolves. The soul remembers that it was never truly alone, it was simply waiting for the frequency of real connection. So now the final question remains, are we willing to become the healed vessel? Not the perfect one, not the famous one, but the real one. Are we willing to allow our wounds to speak not as scars of shame, but as symbols of transmutation? Are we willing to live in such integrity that no force of distortion can find a foothold in our field? Because this is the only way forward. The age of distorted light is ending. The time of performative spirituality is collapsing. What remains, what will endure, are the ones who have walked through the fire and emerged not unburned, but unbound. This is the sacred reversal. The moment we stop running from our wounds and begin to see them as the very portals through which divine light enters. The chosen ones who embrace this path will not be the loudest. They will not always be on stages or trending in algorithms. But when they speak, the room will fall silent. When they touch, healing will occur before words are spoken. When they pray, the earth will listen. because they are no longer just spiritual, they are true. They have turned their pain into prophecy, their shame into sovereignty, their story into scripture. And so we end where we began, light, when unhealed, becomes a weapon. But light, when healed, becomes God walking through flesh. It becomes the flame that no shadow can extinguish, the mirror that no lie can distort, the frequency that calls the world back to itself. And that, beloved, is what you are here to be.